Welcome to the Purposeful MD podcast. As a physician, you've sacrificed so much of your life for other people, your patients, your family, your friends, and your colleagues. What would it feel like to spend time doing what you enjoy and to live without guilt? I'm your host, Dr. Laura Sutton, a family physician, certified coach, and business owner. If you're a medical professional on a journey towards your most purposeful life, a life with more time and energy, and ultimately more joy, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to the Purposeful MD podcast. My guest today is Dr. Christy Gibson. It's a pleasure to have you on, Dr. Gibson. So Dr. Christine Gibson is a family physician, a trauma therapist, author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit with Hatchet Go. She's also on social media as TikTok Trauma Doc, with over 130,000 followers. She's got a master's in medical education, has almost completed a doctorate, and she's been involved in academics and education, creating Calgary's Fellowship in Health Equity. She runs an international nonprofit, Global Family Med Foundation, and a new company to train professionals how to manage workplace trauma called Safer Spaces Training, and a nonprofit, the Belong Foundation. Dr. Gibson, it's great to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate you doing the full intro. It sounds a bit meaty. It's lovely to be here, Laura.
Yeah. So tell me your story. How did you get involved in this work?
I literally did my doctorate on that. So I was studying transdisciplinary work and kind of proving my own portfolios as being transdisciplinary. So, global health, storytelling and narratives, and different forms of knowledge translation, and then social innovation and design thinking. So I think what was a little bit unique about my path is that I was wanting to be more transdisciplinary in my practice. And I don't know when it really started, but I think when I started doing global health work back in 2007 is when I got such a visceral experience of systems thinking and how systems affect health and vice versa. So working in health equity spaces, it's just so much more overt. So wanting to do more at a systems level. So that's like the professional answer. The personal answer was a series of traumas. Like I was caught in the earthquakes in Nepal in 2015 inadvertently, and that really changed the way that I saw the world. I had a pretty disastrous end to a marriage. So, there's just a couple of things that happened to me that I was like, okay, what do I now believe? And I just had to start to figure it out.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. It sounds like you had your world shaken literally and figuratively, right? Being a part of an earthquake, which is not something that is a common experience, especially in the United States. I think it's more common in other parts of the world. And ending a marriage, it just sounds like you're questioning, like you said, who do I want to become? What do I believe? What's my worldview? So is all of this happening around the same time where you're asking yourself these questions and then studying systems thinking and global equity?
I think there really were phases. Like my first phase was doing more global health work and doing a lot of international consulting, and just exploring with a lot of curiosity about how other people live. So that was probably one of the earliest phases in my career. I was doing speckled medical education work throughout that time. So the master's in medical education started around that time too. So like 2008. And I really did see myself as both a physician and a teacher and a learner. I love learning. So it was really fun for me to just try to figure out, well, what do we do after we've completed residency? What's the next thing we learn? And I've always had that kind of curiosity going. So the learning is probably the most continuous aspect of my career, but there's definitely been phases. So there was a global health phase. I really took a deep dive into design thinking and social innovation. I did a 1-month residency, which is quite different than a medical residency, at an arts and leadership center, which was super pivotal in the way that I saw my role and like the way that I can leverage platforms with our, you know, um, the privilege of the letters behind our name and the social position that that grants us. And then trauma and like an understanding of trauma's impact on us individually and collectively has been probably my most recent phase that started around 7, 8 years ago, where I just studied for hours every week and got certified in the alphabet soup of trauma therapies. So it's been like, I would say chapters, but it's not necessarily that I close one chapter to start a new one. They build on each other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So much I want to ask you about all of that. When you talked about the systems thinking and the design thinking in this residency, what what I pictured is learning how we as physicians can impact change on a larger scale than what we might think we can. I feel like there's this collective feeling of powerlessness among a lot of physicians lately,
Yeah,
and I think the pandemic actually worsened that to some extent.
for sure.
And at least that's my feeling. I haven't surveyed anybody, but that's the sense that I get. And so it sounds like this residency really allowed you to see how we can better use our voices and advocate for ourselves and really be a part of the change that we all want to see in the world.
Well, and not just want to see, we have to see it. So the
Right. Right.
pandemic was, in my mind, with a trauma-informed lens, a really strong example of collective dissociation. We are still continuing to deny the long-term effects of the pandemic and the acute crisis we remain in. And then that's like a microcosm of what's happening with climate. Like we have these traumatic abilities to ignore the very real evidence in front of us. And it is a protective mechanism. It's us saying, I actually can't cope with what's in front of me, so I'm going to deny the reality that I'm in. And I think we need both, evidence of reality, and for us to actually be working from a point of absolute truth and not just as social constructs that get perpetuated by people with alternate agendas that are mostly financial and very short term. And we have a very real role in that because we are uh, positioned to be the canaries in the coal mine. Like we are seeing in very real time the health, the mental health, and the social health impacts of these decisions.
Right. Right. And just thinking about how physician burnout and physician well-being is not just it's not an isolated challenge that we as physicians have to face. It affects the health of the entire world because if
Absolutely.
we're not at our best self, then we can't take care of our patients. So that's
Well,
what
and
comes up for me.
yeah, the system really does fall apart when physicians aren't able to participate in the way that the system is designed. And so we're seeing so many health systems collapse because frontline healthcare workers aren't able to or not willing to show up in a system that was not designed to keep really anybody at their best, but definitely physicians.
Yeah.
Like that was one of the earliest traumas that I recognized. Lissa Rankin is a friend who was running a program called Whole Health Medicine Institute, and she would invite healthcare workers who were, I shouldn't say the words burnt out, but looking for new paradigms. And so one of the first things I did after the earthquake, and I listened to one of her TED Talks, was I joined her, the next cohort that was available. And it was 70, mostly female, mostly physicians. And the first thing that she invited us to do was to recognize how much trauma we had faced within our training and within clinical practice. The psychological and physical harms that we had, been placed in and really didn't have a lot of choices over. And I had done hospitalist work for 16 years in my early career. And I would work 80 to 100 hours a week. I had crazy high blood pressure during my night shifts. I learned to completely suppress my very human needs for sleep and food and breaks and rest and pleasure and things that I just learned to do without, especially for like the weeks that I was really on service. So we are trained to dissociate. We are trained to survive traumatic experiences. And because we're so good at suppressing, we suppress our humanity within clinical practice. So we would go from one room talking about somebody's cancer to the next room and running a code, and the next room where somebody has dementia. And we take on so much vicarious suffering. And it wasn't until I learned trauma therapy and started to do that work myself through like really good psychotherapy that I realized how much I was suffering from that too.
Yeah, it's tremendous. And I think non-medical community doesn't really have an appreciation for everything that we experience throughout our training and how that impacts us, even though we, like you said, we suppress it because we have to. It's a protective mechanism, but at some point it starts to come out. And we're actually rewarded for suppressing it. If we think about how we were
Absolutely.
trained and the models that we had, our attending physicians, the residents that came before us. And so, yeah, we were not encouraged to meet our own needs. I think back to surgeries that I scrubbed into as a student where I just had to stand there for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours holding the retractor. And if I asked to use the bathroom or something basic, then I felt like I might be penalized for that. I might get a bad grade on that
Well,
rotation because I
we
had to use the
did.
bathroom. Yeah.
That happened. I had one of my best friends in residency. I actually don't talk about this on podcasts very much, so I'm hesitating to bring it up, but it was very real. She had a brain tumor, and during her ICU rotation, she would have to see her neurosurgeon come and do runs on other brain tumor patients that had been operated on. And she had a GM, so she knew she would die from her
Oh my
illness. And
goodness.
as we were in residency, like she would be very activated during ICU, to the point that her cognitive capacity wasn't available to her. And she failed the rotation. And our program director, instead of saying, wow, these are very extenuating circumstances, sent her to repeat ICU
Wow.
in a rural site. And I will never forgive that person for that.
Right.
Um, it wasn't like she died right away after that, but when I think about the impact of the like inhumanity during some of these choices, yeah, I'm infuriated about it.
Yeah. That's heartbreaking. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you starting to see any shifts in the training environment these days, or do you still feel like it's pretty status quo?
Well, and I think there's different institutional attitudes, I think. Here in Calgary, things are really starting to shift. I mean, they're redesigning the medical school curriculum. And I know some of the people that are very heavily involved in that recreation, they're generalists, which I think is really interesting. I'm a family doctor, and I've done hospital-based practice, community practice, palliative care. Like I've done this huge gamut of things. And I just really think that a generalist perspective instead of a specialist is different. And one of the things that they're doing is they're rewriting all of our problem-based learning from the patient perspective. Instead of saying, you're the doctor coming in the room and this is what the patient's saying, they're actually having us work through cases from the patient's point of view. And just to me, this trauma-informed understanding of how traumatic these interactions are for our patients and how much trauma we hold, that is super foundational. So I think it is sneaking through. We actually, a small committee of us redesigned our history taking program. It's something called the Calgary Cambridge Guide, which is actually universally used. And we've redesigned it to be a more trauma informed discourse. So I really do think that there is appetite in certain environments. And the more that people push to say, how could we do this differently? The better able we are to do that. And I do think the time-based stressors, like in terms of working 36-hour shifts, that has definitely started to shift. And in some jurisdictions, it's legally mandated you can't work more than 12 hours. That does need to change. I mean, we've got really good evidence that working overnight and like into your 22nd hour of shift is the equivalent of drinking a few glasses of alcohol in terms of our critical decision making skills. Why are we still doing this anywhere?
Right. Right. Yeah. If you think about pilots, flight attendants. I mean, I'm sure we've all had situations where we've had flight delays and the crew times out,
Yeah.
and it's frustrating, and it's for our safety because it's not safe for a pilot to be flying when they've been awake for 16, 20 hours. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That has to change.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
unsafe from so many different perspectives. Like we've touched on the physical aspects of it. I mean, it literally shortens our life expectancy. We are also prone to cancers and autoimmune disease and infections because of the risks of sleep deprivation, where our parasympathetic is supposed to be doing the self healing. We have this risk to our psychological safety because of the dissociation and disconnection that is, enforced by the environments where we are, and also just the material that we're dealing with. I mean, we're dealing with suffering, and we're not taught how to process that.
Right.
And then there's the relational aspects, like both the relationships that we are dealing with during our jobs, and then our other relationships. Like, how do we show up given the environments that we're kind of forced to be in?
Right.
Yeah, really big systems level questions.
Yeah. So how do you link the systems thinking and the trauma informed therapy? What's the overlap there in your work?
So many pieces of overlap. So one of the things I did in the modern trauma toolkit was I gave people specific skills, mostly somatic, like how do you regulate your nervous system that you spend more time in the window of tolerance? You feel like you can cope with things. So a big part of burnout is actually our inability to cope. And so some of that can be changed through neuroplasticity, shifts in our brain, and creating different patterns and different frameworks around agency interventions, feeling like we have more control over the areas where we do, and also finding more aspects where we can, you know, um, find pockets of agency and more flexibility than we thought existed in existing paradigms. So that's a piece of it. That's the individual level. But in the book, I also talk on systems, like what can we change at the level of policy? What does it look like to address things like poverty, racism, sexism, and gender-based issues that exist not just within the profession, but we also perpetuate all this stuff because of the way that we're trained and the way that education exists. So there's so many different things that need to shift, and we don't all have to be like the hospital administrator to make these shifts happen. We all have a role to do it within our small clinical practice, within the places where we do education work, research. There's a lot of different leverage points, and we have more power than we think.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely want to get back to that. I want to ask you about something that you mentioned about the window of tolerance. Is that based on, I read a book by Elizabeth Stanley a couple years ago. I would think that was her name, where she talks about, she'd worked with a lot of military recruits, and she talked about she used that term, the window of tolerance, as far as how much an individual can, what's their limit before they get into that fight or flight. How, is that how you're,
So, as far as I know, this term was coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. He's a
okay,
psychiatrist who's
yes.
also written a lot of books. So she would have used that from his description of it. So I've not read Elizabeth Stanley, so I can't say how these concepts overlap. But the way Dan Siegel describes it is that the window is when you have ability to access your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but neither is an overwhelm. So when your sympathetic system's in overwhelm, that is fight and flight. And when your parasympathetic is in overwhelm, that's freeze. And so when physicians are in fight, flight, and freeze, it looks, very typical to how patients look. So we become angry and irritable. We become restless and agitated. We become disconnected and cynical and apathetic. And that is actually traumatic stress. And so we often blame the clinicians who end up in these uh, kind of locked in states. But the way that I see it, which is the lens of compassion and self-compassion, is that it's toxic stress. Because I know I showed up in all of those ways when I was a hospitalist.
Yeah.
And certainly no intention to do so. Like these are subconscious processes. Like when our amygdalas recognize threat, they just put us into a reflex response. And all of a sudden we're in fight, flight, and freeze, or variations of that throughout the day. And we don't really have a conscious understanding of that.
We're
So
kind of,
part of my work is to bring these subconscious processes into conscious awareness so that we have more agency over it.
yeah. And then we can break that cycle. So we're not kind of stuck in this continuous loop because like you said before, it's protective for us at some level. And then uh, it becomes unprotective as it starts to manifest itself in harmful ways. So how does
And
the
what are the things about the system that are creating us to be in such a dire need of protection? I
right,
mean, it's just,
right.
it's it has to change.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely agree. So how would an individual physician who's listening to this, if they're agreeing with all of this and really seeing some of themselves in their environment, what do you recommend?
I mean, my brain works really well through like knowledge exchange. So that's why I've like studied all the things you mentioned. And I'm constantly learning. Like there's hundreds of books around my house that I'm trying to figure out. And I think part of it is finding your niche. It has to do with the ikigai concept, right? Like who are you and what are your special skill set? What in your local environment needs to change and what will somebody allow you to do? Because a lot of us do have some financial privilege that we do have some more time to start doing more advocacy work or systems change off the side of our desks. So, like my startup company is happening off the side of my desk. I wrote the book off the side of my desk. I mean, I did get an advance because I went with a major publisher, but there are ways that we can shift systems, especially when we do have some time-based or financial-based privilege. And then looking for your leverage points. And sometimes they'll surprise you. One of the most interesting things that I learned from that residency was the different ways that I could leverage systems change that I hadn't even thought about. And part of it was like speaking to these players that we think are adversarial. And oftentimes we can find common ground in terms of either values or objectives and speak that similar language and try to um, just see what's possible. I think we feel like these things are unchanging, but they're not. And when the cracks widen, which they really are across the world in terms of the way that health systems are running, when those cracks widen, they actually allow that change to happen at a greater speed. And so rather than us kind of leaning out and saying, oh my gosh, this is so harmful and devastating, yes, and that's an opportunity.
Mhm.
So the more of us that step into it and try to even widen the cracks and say, wow, what else is possible? Like I started a cooperative a few years back and it ended up failing. Like it ended up kind of blowing up from the inside. But part of the intention of that co-op was to say, well, if we band together in a way that almost looks like a union and we kind of try to leverage our collective abilities, what could the system look like? And we were going to try to create like a parallel health system within the co-op. It was, uh, yeah, it was an experiment where all of us learned something and we're all going to grow it in our next work. So like iterating, like this is the PDSA cycle, right? This
Mhm.
is the plan, do, see, act. All of us are doing these mini PDSAs. And if we try to scale them up and try to figure out, well, how else could the health system look within our little context? That's how change happens.
Yeah, yeah. It's those small actions and the small, like you said, groups of people banding together and saying, hey, this is not okay. And what can we do about it? And what comes to mind as I hear you is that takes a certain amount of energy and psychic energy and physical energy, and in order to have that we have to take care of ourselves, and so we have to do all the things that we are telling our patients to do. We have to make sure we're getting enough sleep and taking care of our physical, mental, emotional, social health, and we can't be effective on any level unless we're doing those things. And I love the concept that you brought up about the ikigai, the Japanese concept, and I'm might butcher it, but it's the intersection of what are you good at? What will you get paid for? What does the world need? I'm blanking on the fourth, or maybe it's just three.
Yeah, those three that you mentioned is what's coming to mind for sure. Yeah, I, it's funny. One of the sections in my book, I super randomly did this because I have done so much global health work. And one of the things I wanted to say is that different countries value things differently. Like the hustle culture that exists in North America doesn't even exist in Europe. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's much more of a let's take a siesta mid-afternoon and let's take way more vacation time, and unpaid leaves are quite common. Like the culture that we've been baked in is not universal. It's a social construct, and
Right.
we can deconstruct it.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the many things that I've studied is social constructivist theory, and it just shows us that all truth is pretty truthy. Like the truth that exists in 2020 was pretty different than what existed in 1999 when I graduated medical school, or 1973 when I was born. Like truth is constantly changing, and we can actually be agents of change within truth. And that to me is just gives me a lot of hope and playfulness about it. And I think the more that we can latch on to our sense of purpose and meaning, our connectivity to each other, to our patients, to our communities, to nature, to pets, like this greater ecosystem. Like connection is a really big part of healing trauma. And then hope. Like we really need a sense of possibility. Nothing is locked in. I mean, the fact that things are changing at such a drastic rate can seem really scary and dangerous, but it also is an opportunity for us to do something really differently.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this inflection point and we can really take advantage of it. And that does give me a lot of hope too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I, you're right about that psychic energy and physical energy as well. Like I've had to step down and just do like kind of 3 days, 3.5 days of clinical practice in order to do this other stuff. But, I'm mid-career. I can do that now. And I think more of us can carve out that time than we think we can. This is a part of systems changes to actually model, like, what does it look like to be actually healthy in this role? And for us to say like we are purveyors of well-being and not actually finding it within ourselves, it's a problem.
Yeah.
um one of the reasons that I wrote the modern trauma toolkit was to say to professionals, like, um even though there has been this trauma that we have universally faced within our own bodies and within the relationships that we are managing other people's disease states, and then this greater ecosystem within healthcare and the bigger and bigger fractals, there is also so much joy and abundance and beauty and connection and meaning. And all of that is true at the same time. So there's this real dichotomy. And I think it's so much easier for us to feel the suffering when that's congruent with how we feel inside. And so the more that we can heal ourselves, the more that we have access to all these other things that are also true. So a lot of us are just seeing suffering with these blinders. And I know it took me a lot of healing and deconstruction before I could see something different.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. And that we have to be able to even pay attention and take off the blinders and pay attention to the joy and the beauty that's around us. And that can take a lot of work. And when it works, it's beautiful at the end. I know that for sure.
I don't know that it takes a lot of work. I think what it takes is a different path. I
Hmm.
think we've been told this is the path you go on, and we just kind of go on that path. But the opposite of trauma isn't being like happy all the time. The opposite is
Right.
flexibility. And so for us to even visualize that other paths are possible, and they're not necessarily harder to walk down, they're just
Hmm.
different.
Hmm.
So the more that we
Yeah.
can see possibilities and flexibility that has always been available to us, that is healing from trauma.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. It's just different. Not
Just
necessarily
different.
harder. It's just different. Yeah.
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 Well, Dr. Gibson, it's been so wonderful to talk with you and learn from you and have you on today. I really appreciate such a great conversation, and I know it's going to resonate with a lot of folks. And we'll definitely include your TikTok links and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter in our show notes so our listeners can check you out. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, no problem, Laura. I might just say that for those who are kind of trying to look for that hope. The one concept that we haven't talked about yet is post-traumatic growth and the difference between resiliency and post-traumatic growth. And that's what I really think is possible for us at an individual and a system level. So that's the concept I'd love to leave with your listeners. And yeah, thanks for some really engaging and insightful conversations and questions.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely have you back and we can talk about that as well, because I'm super interested in all of this. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Purposeful MD podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review the show. Please also visit my website, www.thepurposefulmd.com, for free downloads or to discuss working with me as your coach.